time to participate on this panel at a relatively early hour for each of you. I'm wrapping up my visit in Delhi tonight. It's 6:30 p.m. on Wednesday, and I've been at Enrich since Monday. And I'll say that the last 2.5 days have been very, very exciting. This was my first Enrich conference that I've attended, and I must say that the energy in the room, the diversity of perspectives that the KPMG India team was able to pull together, and the networking that happened, especially yesterday at the conference, was pretty remarkable. So truly, world-class event. And I know that Enrich is a flagship program for the India firm, and this is the 13th year that the firm has successfully pulled this off. And so a huge kudos to Anish Day, the global energy lead at KPMG and KPMG India for pulling this together. For the audience, let me quickly introduce the panelists. Jornolf Ostwick is the founder and CEO of Ecogenesis, a technology company focused on alternative energy, sustainable materials manufacturing, resource recovery, and advanced recycling methods. Jornolf has over 15 years of experience in advanced technologies, energy infrastructure, and engineering, and has a long history of fostering collaborations that further sensible energy and sustainability policies. Jim Pike is the founder and managing director of TCB Advisors, LLC, focused on helping companies navigate the energy transition. He has worked with companies across the Americas, Asia, and Europe. Jim has substantial consulting and executive experience in the energy sector. He's also worked in corporate venture capital and private equity. His focus industries include energy with a focus on renewable energy and related technology, industrials, and service companies. My colleague Franceli Jodis is a seasoned energy professional who's passionate about power and utilities and energy transition. As the global head of power and utilities at KPMG, Franceli is responsible for helping the P&U community develop an understanding of global challenges and trends, promoting best practices, exchanges between countries, and developing global solutions according to market demand. And I'm your host and moderator for this evening, Arun Mani. I'm a partner with a U.S. firm, and I'm based in Houston. I lead the U.S. firm's power and utility strategy practice, been a student of the sector for almost 30 years. Once again, it gives me great pleasure to welcome all the panelists, all the speakers, and I'm also thrilled to be the last act before Enrich wraps up for 2022. So without further ado, let's get into the questions. And I'm going to start with Jornolf. Jornolf, it was interesting, and I'm actually pleased that you're part of the panel because there was a lot of discussion yesterday, in fact, started off by the Minister of Petroleum in India about using existing coal facilities to swap out the fuel to something more green generated by waste. And so the timing of having you on this panel could not be better. I'd really appreciate if you could start with an overview of your business for a few minutes, and then we can get into some very specific questions. So over to you, Jornolf.
Sure. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So thank you all for having me, and KPMG for allowing me to participate. Very briefly, I do have a long history in a variety of renewable energy technologies, especially bioenergy. I started at Lockheed Martin, the large defense contractor in aerospace, and started their biosynthetic fuels program, amongst others. I've advised private equity firms, so I sort of appreciate the commercial and financing side, and I've worked for a long time with the Department of Energy Laboratories on things like combustion of advanced fuels and different renewable pathways. So with my company Ecogenesis, which stands for Ecologically Generating Sustainable Resources, what I did is waste generated or waste derived fuels go back to the 1970s and 80s. There was a lot of advancement and investment then. And interestingly, a lot of the advancement in solid recovered fuels stopped in the early 90s. There's some reports out of the U.S. Department of Energy around then, and a lot of it was just coal was cheap and there weren't big drivers to continue the state. So what we did is we sort of picked up from there and continued solving the technical challenges that remained, in the early 90s. So Ecogenesis is a company focused on recycling waste. We have a very unique recycling system. We call it the Rhino Recycler. It can be deployed in existing infrastructure, and it recycles unsorted, mixed wastes. They can be high moisture. It can be a combination of sludge and waste. It could be just municipal solid waste. And we recycle that. There are a number of pathways, including advanced sustainable materials, but for this conference, I'll focus on the fuel side. So we have what I think is the world's leading waste-derived fuel. It's actually, we have patents around the composition of it itself. It's a direct replacement for coal in existing power plants or industrial boilers or cement factories, but really what we developed it for was the power sector. So it can replace coal on a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of energy content, including in pulverized coal boilers. And we have more than 80 patents worldwide, and I'm pleased to say that in India, we have, as of last year, our core process and our core fuel composition patents are granted there, which, if nothing else, shows you that it's a very unique fuel. So I'm very excited about the potential of taking base load power generating assets and giving them a near-term, quick way of converting to a waste-derived fuel, and it's an exciting time. I'll also say, as a last point, that the world is waking up to this. As you mentioned, there were those comments and a lot of activity in the last 48 hours, and it happens to be that last year the International Standards Organization, ISO, published the first ever global waste-derived fuel standards, and so that's a big advancement. There's been some that existed the last 10 years in Europe, but now you finally have a framework for everyone across the world to be talking to each other about the same commodity classes and actually having published standards around that. So thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
That's great, Jornolf. Again, yesterday during the breaks, as I was talking to some of the people, my feedback to them was, I said, dial in and listen to this call at 6:30 because it's not science fiction. The technology exists. We're actually going to have a speaker, a company that is doing this, and so this is pretty real. But it was just interesting timing about what people were talking, and so a lot of excitement about using lots of gigawatts of available capacity, is repurposing that for a much cleaner, much better fuel. Jim, I'm going to move on to you as the next panelist. I know you've spent a lot of time in the industry in your career, specifically with renewables. But perhaps if you could just take a step back and macroscopically, if you could maybe tell the audience your perspective, share some perspectives about the energy transition situation in the U.S. in general, and specifically the Inflation Reduction Act. That was another topic that I talked to yesterday. There was quite a bit of an interest about just the massive volume of funding that the federal government in the U.S. is putting out there for new technology. So we'd love to get your take on just how you see energy transition, play out presently, and then any predictions for the future.
Sure. Thank you, Arun, and thank you, Anish, for the introductions, and thank you to the audience for joining us at this last session of the Enrich 2022 conference, and it's a pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists to share some thoughts and perspectives. I think, Arun, when you mentioned the energy transition, it's worthwhile to think of what does that really mean. You can think of it through a view through themes or economic sectors like transportation and industrials, or you can think about it from an energy source. I think a critical concept is it's not just about doing the same things exactly the same way, just in a lower carbon fashion, but rather it'll involve rethinking our approaches to business models and services and the way we help end customers, especially when you think of things like mobility. It's not necessarily just let's put a giant battery in a truck and keep running the same routes and doing everything the same way. But let me take a moment and describe it a bit more through a lens of themes. And I think there's three themes that I see that will help drive the energy transition. And the first, of course, is decarbonization. The climate change is a defining challenge for our time. It stretches across all segments and all verticals. And finding ways to decarbonize how we do everything will be critical for the world and for the US. I think the second theme I would look at is decentralization. As we have the emergence of distributed energy resources, in particular rooftop solar and EVs and storage, these are the technologies that will help support the energy transition, and they create new opportunities, and they also create some new challenges. And then the third aspect or theme I would think about is dynamic pricing, and this mostly applies to the electricity sector. We currently have time of use pricing in some cases, but mostly we have fixed pricing. You're in a certain tier, you've bought a certain amount of electricity in the US, you pay a certain price. You have demand charges, you have your energy charge, and you have your monthly charge. And the importance of this, I think, in the future is sending the right price signals to end customers. Just as we have wholesale prices in markets that send those price signals, translating that down to the end customer on a retail basis will be valuable. So we don't expect the customer to adjust their consumption that way, but ultimately to have the equipment to interpret those price signals and the algorithms to decrease demand at peak times, but also make use of surplus energy that might otherwise have been curtailed. And so in these lenses, I think we can step over and think about what does the Inflation Reduction Act do to support the energy transition in the US. And that would focus on the extension of the ITC and the PTC. There's a long pathway now for wind and solar to be developed, to be extended. We have adders in the Inflation Reduction Act that increase the ITC from 30%, which is a step up from the 26 to the 22. But these adders account for energy communities. There's a plus 10% for that. For use of domestic manufactured equipment and supplies, there's another 10% adjustment for that. So at the peak, you could potentially get an ITC of 50%, which is very compelling. Also in the IRA, you have support for standalone storage. You also have support for EV infrastructure, and you have support for hydrogen. And all of these things have a long runway that provides support to the installation of these new technologies that will help us decarbonize.
No, that's great, Jim. In the last couple of days, the decarbonization and decentralization have both been key themes, and different speakers and panelists have actually covered that. But I think what you mentioned about dynamic pricing is interesting. I think we all know that not every electron is created in the same way, and from a pricing perspective, is consumed in the same way. So I think it's good to see that there's some innovation happening from a commercial perspective as well. So I think excellent points that you make. Franceli, moving to you, just curious, you're in Sao Paulo in Brazil. You look at the United States, you look at South America. Would welcome your thoughts in terms of just your views on what the U.S. is doing and how that impacts the global economy. Maybe perhaps starting off with South America. So would welcome your reflection. So why don't you have the floor?
All right. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you all, my colleagues here, and it's a glad to be here with you guys. Thank you, the audience, for being with us. So my reflection, Aaron, let me start to talk about South America. In South America, we have already a strong presence of renewable in the energy matrix, but some countries are very dependent on hydro. And so, and we had, in the other hand, we have some countries as Chile, such as Chile, that is still dependent on coal. Therefore, we have a part of a group working to reduce the reliance of hydropower, and other part of the countries working to decarbonize their energy matrix. The good news that we have in the zone, a huge level of sun and high winds. Due to that, the countries are working to the energy transformation agenda to modernize their energy system, to allow new technologies, and of course to increase the renewables such as solar and wind. But the important things to mention about energy transition in the region, that we have an agenda. The decarbonization agenda in Latin America or in South America is very close to economic transition. Thus, the energy transition must be very aligned to the concept of just transition, where nobody is left behind. And this is a huge challenge for us. And keep that in mind, Chile has a strategy to export hydrogen in 2030. And other countries such as Peru, Colombia, Brazil are working on the same agenda, taking the advantage of having high potential high potential level of renewables to reduce to produce green hydrogen. But in this way, we could discuss the U.S. Act, how the U.S. Act is impact or will impact the South America, for example. I think the impact of South America will be focused on market competition to export energy. As I said, Chile started the strategy. Actually, Chile is implementing a strategy to export hydrogen, green hydrogen, in 2030. So South America and other markets are planning to export green hydrogen to Europe. But now we may review their business or because they will compete. They will have a U.S. as a very strong competition. So I think this is the major impact. But taking a broader view, I think we have seen already the migration of corporate investments to U.S. since Washington announced the industrial subsidy scheme to support green industries. We have seen some movements from industries reconsidering to start the new operation in Europe and moving to U.S. One recent announced was Tesla or Solvay. So, but I believe that Europe may prepare some reaction to stop this movement. But this is a very important movement that we have seen already. But we have the supply chain impacts also. Even though I don't think it is the main issue of IRA, Aaron. I think I believe the supply chain of renewable technology will become very stressed in a short term. But in a medium and long term, the manufacturers developed in the US will improve the number of equipments globally. And so we're going to have a balance of the supply chain. But we have China. But even China, I think in case of batteries, they dominate the midstream battery components manufacturing process. So several leading EV or battery corporates have started plans to increase the participation in US market. but it won't affect the supply chain of China. Chinese batteries companies have space to grow not only in the domestic market, but also they can. I think they are very well positioned for capture or to capture the global battery demand growth. And so I think Chinese it's also looking to move their companies to US to enjoy the benefits, but it will not exclude the supply chain from China from the game. I think this is a very important impact. Another impact that we are seeing, Aaron, I think is the cost of capital. Actually, the cost of capital in the beginning, at the first time, I had some concern about the run of investments to US, especially with this nowadays inflation rate. But and I have seen some discussions about it. But I have thought about, and I have discussed it with some investors in a couple of days, in the last couple of days, and I believe that the movement of US will not impact the emerging markets. The investor that goes to emerging countries are looking for higher rates of return, even with more risks. They cannot find it kind of investments or this kind of rates in the developed countries. So, and I think with the decarbonization movement, Aaron, energy became a much more strategic source globally, and the stock sector got much more value than before. And I think it will continue to attract more and new kind of investors. So I think it's as a big issues. I think it's a good start.
Princely, you put a lot out there. I'm going to try to summarize for the audience. There's really three themes that I picked up. One is the whole the energy transition equals economic transition, and the whole idea of doing it in a just manner from a social equity perspective. I think that's absolutely agree with you, and I think there are definitely certain pockets in the U.S. and also around the world where that rings pretty true. I mean, you've got, again, classic older facilities. You can't just shut them down overnight, and so you got to be careful about how you're going through this transition. Supply chain. I think we've all lived the supply chain challenges in the last year now, or a couple of years, post-COVID. I think the stress systems have gotten even worse now. And so supply chain is top of mind across every industry, I would say. And then I think the cost of capital it's an interesting observation. Yesterday in my panel, I talked about, again, really one of the things that the IRA is really doing is, bringing back the business case analysis on trading capex for opex. You've got certain in certain cases you're getting a capex breaks, in other cases, again, does that really hedge you against some of that uncertainty from an O&M perspective? So I think great points. I'm going to come back to you and pick up on a couple of these, but let me circle back to Jornolf and let's move the dialogue to the continent of Europe and the Ukraine war that's been going on for the last many months now, over a year. And I bring that up because of the Ukrainian situation. Again, this was mentioned by a couple of the speakers yesterday. Europe is actually, Germany specifically, has actually repowered some of their shuttered down coal assets. So just curious, Jornolf, we talked about India as part of your introduction, but just more macroscopically in Europe and perhaps elsewhere, even South America. What's your view about, again, the waste generated, fuel that your firm is specializing in? And I mean, are there, how do you see the opportunities, I guess, more globally?
Yeah, so I mean, it's actually a fascinating development that there's more focus as a result of the war to energy security than I've seen in my entire career in energy. I mean, and I actually, coming from a defense contractor and supporting actually the Department of Defense in energy projects, for me, I actually started in energy from an energy security perspective. But that was more on the defense side as opposed to the commercial sector. But now you see the two merging, and it's had a profound impact on how governments and utilities are looking at things. So yes, there's coal-powered generating assets that are being fired up back up, and it's actually utilities are and governments are a bit disheartened because they had these renewable targets. They were working towards them. And for real near-term baseload power needs, they've realized we need to go back to coal in some ways and increase our usage. And that is driving a need for looking for baseload and near-term, not 20 years from now, but today, near-term baseload renewable substitutes. And what's better than a waste-derived fuel that can go into those coal power plants, and you get the base load power, you get the benefits of that, but then you don't have an increase in coal usage. So you get the best of both worlds in a sense. There's also the aspect that waste is often generated by societies in correlation with population size and level of economic activity, which then correlates to power needs as well. So the U.S. has the highest per capita waste generation rate. As societies develop their populations and their economic status, they also need more power, and they also happen to generate more waste. So there's a direct correlation between the availability of waste, and if you look at it that way as an actual useful substance, there's a direct correlation between the availability of waste and a country's need for power and growing population and growing economic status. And so there's huge interest in being able to convert waste to fuels and useful products as a way of essentially having a domestic generated fuel supply. So I'm seeing greater interest now, not just in Europe, but actually in the rest of the world too, because they see how quickly things changed. Germany. If you go back 2 years ago, there were no plans on increasing coal usage. And the fact that could switch so quickly, I see that opening up, the eyes in other areas too, saying, wow, things can change very quickly. And suddenly we come to rely on these baseload power assets, and maybe we need them in service for another 20, 30 years. And does that necessarily mean we have to stay on coal? That's the only, and they're saying, no, we need to find other solutions. And so, whether it's biomass fuels, but those are more limited in supply and are lower energy content, waste-derived fuels are seeing a renaissance, in a sense, because people recognize you already have the material. It's already circulating. It's got actually more energy potential than wood or biomass, and you can use it in the existing generating assets. And then the other aspect too is that the rising prices in coal and the rising transport costs and the rising logistical challenges in moving coal around, sometimes by supply chain constraints, shipping route, constraints, things like that, are also actually opening the door to, new alternative fuels like waste-derived fuels to come in and be as economical or even more economical than coal. So it's definitely an interesting time. From our company's perspective, we're glad to be where we are now. We're glad to have done all the work to prepare for this moment. We couldn't have predicted that it would be so sudden and the demand would be so high, but we're glad to be able to offer a solution.
And Jornolf, let me stay with you and just ask you one other follow-on question, if that's okay, which is because you mentioned about renewables as well, and a question is that with the fuel that you're patenting and you're specializing in, basically a coal substitute, how do you see that play along with renewables, solar, wind, green hydrogen, etc.? Where in the portfolio do you see your product fit in? Is it a bridge fuel or is it something more permanent? Love to kind of get your thoughts from a portfolio perspective.
Yeah, so I've always had a very specific view on this, which is that it is a bridge fuel. Whether that's 20 years, whether that's 30 years, I don't know. That's changing a little bit. We designed our processes such that the recycling infrastructure that gets installed, you can use that for fuel generation, and then you can switch it over very easily. I mean, actually within a few hours, to a sustainable materials production capability. So deploying this recycling infrastructure does not mean that you've committed to a waste-derived fuel in perpetuity. It's the same recycling infrastructure that you would use for sustainable building products. The near-term demand for coal alternative fuels is driving that side very much. And my view is that even people are often not quite aware of how much coal is used. It's billions and billions of tons a year, depending on how you sort of adjust for the lignite content. It's several billion tons a year, and it's rising for the most part. I mean, I used to say a year or two ago that in the last 5 years, 3 of those years, global coal demand went up. And so, it's easy in America, for example, it's very easy to fall into this view that, coal plants are on their way out and they're all going to be gone in a few years. No. There's still a significant part of the baseload power generating capacity of the U.S. and a growing important part of in Asia, in India. NTPC just put out an RFP this month for something like almost 7 gigawatts more coal generating capacity. So this is being built. And even in the US, existing power plants, coal plants, often have decommissioning dates out in the 2040s. It's one thing to say we've got this plan to get off of coal, but those plans often involve another 20, 30 years of existing coal firing at existing assets, plus in many countries, and this also goes for the Middle East, North Africa, parts of Eastern Europe, new coal generating assets being built. And so if we can offer a bio-derived alternative that allows the usage of those for the next 20 to 30 years, then you bridge towards the other solution. So, it might be that in 2050, we have solar, wind, energy storage, hydro, and we have 100% clean energy. But along the way, let's decarbonize as much as we can on that pathway. Because a lot of damage can be done to the climate over the next 20 to 30 years, and we can't just ignore that. So my view has always been we need to focus on where we're headed 30 years from now, but also do everything we can to decarbonize over the next 25 years during that bridge period. And, there's other benefits too with us, and I don't want to make this just about, what we're doing, but landfills are one of the top 3 methane generating human activities on Earth. Everyone knows power sector, everyone knows agriculture. Almost no one knows landfills is the other big one. And methane is 28 to 36 times more potent as a greenhouse gas, but it only has a half-life of 12 years, which means if you stop methane generating now, you actually have an outsized influence on helping protect the atmosphere. So methane is a very important target that we should be targeting. And by using waste-derived fuels, not only are you replacing coal, but you're also completely stopping the methane generation at one of the top 3 causes of methane release in the world. So that's why you actually get this dual benefit on both sides, and that's why I think it's so important to make this transition.
Terrific, Jornolf. Again, appreciate the insights, perspectives. Just a shout out to the audience. We're at about 35 minutes in, and I know yesterday when we were actually doing this thing live, we could actually ask people for questions. So again, to the extent people have any questions, please keep them coming. We'll try to use a few minutes towards the end to respond to the questions. But with that, let me move to Jim. And Jim, I'm going to put you on the spot on maybe a couple of technologies. Again, staying with the same theme of that portfolio. Green hydrogen, a very interesting technology. A lot of talk about it. A lot of people are interested. And then one more mature technology is solar, both, utility scale, rooftop solar, also community solar. Love to get your thoughts on both of these technology variants. Again, seems like, solar's got a bit of tailwind there. So like to see, get your take on the technology and the type of customers or industries that would benefit from each one of those types of technologies.
Right. So I think let's just start with green hydrogen first. And so green hydrogen, as everyone knows, is hydrogen derived through an electrolysis process using renewable energy. It effectively has close to 0 carbon content per kilogram of H2 produced. And so I think you can think quickly two things. You can think in the near term and you can think in the long term of where we'll see green hydrogen. In the near term, when green hydrogen is still effectively a premium product, you might see end customers who are interested in, and there'll be a couple different steps that you'll go through. Somebody has to ultimately pay a premium to use the product in the near term. And so you can think of what are consumer products that might be more marketed with green steel, and then that steel manufacturer would be a customer for green hydrogen production. You might see folks using green ammonia as a co-firing solution to produce less carbon-intensive electricity, and so that would be an end customer for green hydrogen production. But if you look over the longer term, I think you'll see green hydrogen when it reaches economic parity, with or without the incentives. Perhaps somewhere very far in the future, you'll see it being an economic leader for hydrogen. Obviously, at that point in the long term, it would displace existing hydrogen production. However, in particular, and Bjornolf kind of hit on this too, he mentioned the methane and the dispatchability of methane. NREL in the U.S. has done research for the National Renewable Energy Laboratories, did research and worked with LADWAP to produce a paper that said, well, how do we get to 100% renewables or 100% sort of 0 carbon electricity in our system? And that pathway requires the use of green hydrogen as a dispatchable fuel in combined cycle turbine processes. And so I think long term, that will be sort of a very key component. It's a key aspect of energy transition, and it will be critical to states who have committed to 100% RPS, so Colorado and California and New York, the use of hydrogen as a dispatchable fuel to help balance their grids. It'll be essential. There's probably not a pathway there without it. And so let's shift over and think about solar. I think solar the Inflation Reduction Act gave a lot of support to solar, gave support to manufacturing. So Enphase has announced they'll begin manufacturing microinverters in the U.S. The goal here is to ensure that there's enough U.S. manufactured content to capture that additional 10% bonus to the ITC. SMA had previously manufactured inverters in the U.S. in a facility in my backyard in Denver. That facility shut down, but I think we'll see other announcements of manufacturers looking to produce domestic content to capture the additional incentives. Because you can think quickly, if you think of a 10% ITC, and you think of the material supply for solar as being roughly, call it $1, if you add up the modules, the inverters, the racking, and you think of getting a 10% bonus on a $1 to $3 system, whether you're a utility or maybe a residential rooftop, that's 10 cents to 30 cents of credit that you can create. And so there's a big economic incentive to get that when you think of, what's the cost of an inverter on a per watt basis. That's a lot of credit. You can incur some extra costs to get it done. I think if you shift the question to things like community solar, the Inflation Reduction Act created a long runway. Community solar is pretty interesting because it generally requires state level policy to be supportive of it, whether it's through a solar garden type of legislation that exists in Colorado, or virtual net metering that exists in places like New York and California. Community solar benefits from that. And to the extent that we see additional legislation, that will continue to support community solar. But ultimately, I think over the long term, I think the concept of community solar becomes less powerful. It's a solution for residential customers who can't have their own rooftop solar, either because they live in an apartment building or they have shading over their house, or perhaps even for aesthetic reasons. They don't want the solar panels on their rooftop. But if solar becomes cheap enough, that's the lowest cost solution for utilities to install. That's sort of the ultimate form of community solar, in that utilities say this is the lowest cost, we'll place it on the grid, and all customers will benefit from it. So I see community solar has some benefits to customers who can't access it, but at some point, if your state doesn't have policies that support it, it might not be an option. The other choice is your utility can develop programs for community solar and then offer it. But if it's a low cost solution, the utility will most likely simply install it as part of its generation stack, and it will provide benefits to all customers. So that's a transition question there for community solar.
No, that's great, Jim. So I'm actually getting some questions out here through the net as well, and actually I'm going to take the liberty to move to Franceli and in fact pose one of the questions to her. So I guess it's a two-part question, Franceli. One is, what are the kinds of topics that your clients in South America, Brazil and South America, are thinking about? What's top of mind for them is the first part of the question. And then the second question actually is, do you feel the pace of energy transition in the Americas, so North and South Americas, is adequate?
Aaron, the first question is for sure the client. The client is in the all the time in the mind of our clients. My clients here in South America are very, very concerned about how to improve their relationship, how to afford the best service to the client, and how to change their business model to attend these clients. For sure, clients is in the top of their mind. And before improving the operation, before affordability, all the companies are here in South America are investing a lot to understand their clients. The second question, I could say that we have. I'm very optimistic, Aaron. I think that we have a spectacular moment to work in the same agenda, even though that we have a different scenarios or different matrix or even different consumers. All the global is working for the same agenda to decarbonize our matrix, to reduce our climate change, and to modernize our system. So I think it's a huge moment to work together in a way to find new technologies. I think, and I think with a good eyes this program of US, because now we can use R&D projects to think or rethink the way that we produce energy, rethink the way that we are going to deliver energy. Because in the past, all the technology that we see in the US Act, for example, Aaron, is there are some all the technologies are here for decades. We are always using R&D to improve to improve the cost, to improve the technology. But now we have a single opportunity to rethink everything, to thinking beyond 2050. I think with this action, we're going to develop the technology, and we're going to develop the way that we produce energy around the world. And this is a very good news for me.
That's great, Francelina. I appreciate your thoughts on that. Another question, and I'm actually going to take a first stab at responding to it, which is the role of nuclear. And the specific question is, given the geopolitical sensitivity around nuclear, what role do you see nuclear playing in the future energy mix of Americas? Jim, I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well. But personally, I think small modular reactors are pretty exciting. In the past, it's always been baseload nuclear facilities, over 1,000 megawatts. And so there's been issues about siting them, getting them grid connected. But now with these more, I would say, nuanced technologies that can be integrated into the grid faster, can be integrated with renewables faster, I think nuclear holds a huge promise. I think there are still some questions about how commercial it is going to be from a price perspective. So that's my take, is that I definitely see some silver lining around small modular reactors as one of the technologies. But Jim, your views on nuclear, and also probably it's the same question that I asked Franceli. Your thoughts on what the U.S. has done, or in general in America, is the pace of energy transition.
So I think the two questions there. I think you're right with small modular reactors as holding a lot of promise. It is certainly a commercial question, right? So the U.S. government's been placing small modular reactors in submarines for quite a while, and so the technology is there and can be done. The question is, can we do it in a commercial way that provides a low-cost, baseload, zero-emission source of electricity? And I think it's a space that will receive investment. It's space that's worth pursuing. I think it's still a somewhat open question if we can get there. Hopefully we can, because it would be a huge benefit to energy transition. I think when we come back to the overall pace of energy transition, right? So if you look in Europe, if you look in the US, if you look in a few other parts of the country, emissions are coming down as a whole. As Bjornhoff has mentioned, people are still, in China and India and other places, we're still increasing coal consumption, increasing emissions from energy production, There's a lot of people in the world who want automobiles, who want air conditioning. Some part of that is a vicious cycle. If you think of global warming and now we want air conditioning, it creates a challenge. I think the pace, I think there's a lot of signs of hope. But every time you listen to the results of the global conferences, is the 1.5 degree trajectory still possible? Is it 2 degrees? I think the reality is the pace is inadequate. We're not getting to the points that we need to achieve. And I think there's an important concept, I think, for the audience to think, and I believe we referenced it already. It's sort of a cumulative impact. We have this number of emissions we can emit into the air to keep ourselves below certain thresholds. And simply achieving net zero is, depends on the pathway. If we go at the current rate and all of a sudden magically in 2050 we drop from today's rate to zero, we've kind of missed the target by a long ways. And so the faster we can reduce, the quicker we can reduce, because it's a cumulative impact, will be very important. So we're hopeful with the technologies. And I think a key technology will ultimately be direct air capture, that we can actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to drive the concentration down towards a level that will be more acceptable. But this is a big challenge.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. So I know we've got the last, 8 minutes now as we're counting down to Enrich. And so I'm going to take it back to Jornolf, and probably for each one of you, love to get maybe a couple minutes, your thoughts on energy transition. And then I'm going to say 3 words, which have been the hallmarks of this year's Enrich, which is security, affordability, and sustainability. So your thoughts on energy transition and impacts for each one of those 3 dimensions. And so you can pick one or have some thoughts on all 3. That'd be great. But just love to have some closing thoughts for each one of you. So Jornolf, why don't you tee it off, and then Franceli, I'll actually come to you then next, and then Jim will close with you. And audience, we'll see if we can have time for maybe one other question. But go ahead, Jornolf.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, the most exciting development, I think now is that, in contrast with, 10, 15 years ago, there's increasing recognition that we need to think in terms of a diverse set of solutions, and we need to think more holistically. And I'm seeing that actually even the terminology is changing from sort of energy transition to energy transformation, which sort of implies that it's not a switch from one thing to the other with a flip of a switch, but rather it's an evolving transformation to a new normal. And that is allowing people to step back and say, okay, it's not just get as many solar panels as we can out there, which is a lot of what the mantra was 10, 15 years ago. Now it's, wait a second, we need to think about everything. We need to go back and look at all the different sources of greenhouse gases. We need to look at the full energy picture, and we need to look at how we actually transform over a period of 20 or 30 years. And that's actually more productive. I think a much more productive exercise because I think everyone can get on board with that. Everyone recognizes the need for it. So that's a very good development. And in that, it actually also allows us to look at the different components, which you mentioned, security, affordability, and sustainability. So once you start looking at things in terms of being a transformation, it allows the dialogue and analysis to look at all those aspects. And I do think that the innovation, this drives innovation. I mean, that's really what my background mostly is in, and how do you actually innovate? How do you create new technologies, especially in large corporations? How do they innovate? And when you have different pathways and a holistic view, you have a lot of innovation, and that is bringing down costs. It's making them more scalable and viable, which is great for affordability. And then, as I said, the diversity of solutions and the holistic view is also providing a basis to ensure that countries can maintain their energy security while also evolving to their sustainability goals.
Perfect. No, that's great. Franceli, just a minute, if you can give us your thoughts very quickly. We'd appreciate it.
Okay, no, very, very objective way. I think it's sustainability. It's about considering all the sources, consider all the technologies, consider all the capabilities for a new world. I think we are in an excited moment as a global company, actually, Aaron, because we can help the clients to understand and learn with each other mistakes, and I think this is a huge moment to collaborate together to create new technologies, to create new ways of living in the world.
Excellent. Jim?
I think Gernot hit on a lot of key points with the security aspect. I think I would add one concept of reliability. And when we think of technology as an important technology, I think we would add our demand side management technologies and efficiencies and peak shaving. And the goal is, how do we keep our low carbon, zero carbon electric system in balance between supply and demand? And I think that's a key thing going forward. We had informal pleas in California to stop your consumption. We'll need more sophisticated technologies and approaches to balance that, because renewables are an intermittent resource, and it'll be key.
No, that's great, Jim. Actually, I'm so glad that you mentioned it, because a concept that again came up yesterday was, supply and demand, and there's a lot of discussion on the supply side. All the technologies are focused on the supply side, but I think conservation, energy efficiency, people forget that's the first order fuel. I mean, it doesn't cost you any money; you just consume less. And so I think conservation, energy efficiency, they don't have the excitement like green hydrogen does or solar does. But again, let's face it, it's again very, very economical. So I'm glad you mentioned the whole supply side. This has been great, folks. So again, thank you so much. My closing thought is this, and what I said yesterday to the audience, and I'd like to repeat myself here, is that what's exciting for me, and the reason I wake up every morning and come out and work with clients is, look, the global economy was built over the last 200 years on the back of carbon, on the back of fossil facilities. I mean, that's where the global economy basically developed. And what we're now talking about is the next 20 to 30 years to change that to a cleaner form of energy. I think, Jornolf, your point about it's not going to happen by just snapping your fingers. It's a journey. It's a transformation. Absolutely. But I think we don't have much time. I think 2050, no matter where you go, we're talking 2045, you're talking 2050. I know there are certain parts of India which is talking 2070, but still, no matter where you're looking at it, when you look ahead, we're talking about in 20, 30, 40 years to change something that took us 5 times those number of years to build, 200 years, and now we're trying to change it in like 20 to 40 years. So I think each one of us has a certain obligation, a certain challenge that I think we just have to do our part. And I'm glad that I've had the opportunity to again be in New Delhi in India, be part of Enrich, and be part of some of these conversations. And again, I'm glad we're having a chance to close this out this evening with this very, very exciting panel. So on that note, folks, thank you very much for signing in. Anish and KPMG India, thank you for having us. And I will sign off. And good night, everyone, and good morning to everyone in America.
Thank you.